person and then store it somewhere else. So my fancy new site.com, and you would buy it, and then you would go and hook it up to a host. So the two hosting providers that I typically use for all my projects are either DreamHost or Cloudways. DreamHost is more basic and more affordable. And the beauty is that they both have a really easy to use interface. They make it a lot easier to manage the day-to-day needs of your website. Whereas a lot of hosting panels to this day are still really annoying and difficult to deal with. So just for that reason alone, I recommend those two panels. And a lot of my own sites and the companies I work for, they're all set up on those types of places. This is what DreamHost looks like. And if you look right over here, you can see the following. You have every website, especially every WordPress website, has two components. It has files, which get stored. It's like, think about the images or any code that all sits in one place, and then a database. The database you can think of as like an Excel spreadsheet that stores rows of content of various kinds. Almost every WordPress website and almost every website nowadays has its files and its database. When you do a big migration of a website, you're moving it from one place to another, and there's a ton of files. I just yesterday migrated a 30 gigabyte website. The database for hundreds of articles was only a couple megabytes because it's literally just rows of data in like an Excel style file. But then the files might be huge. There might be videos and photos and stuff like that. And that's what combines to make the website. One of the really great things about both DreamHost and Cloudways is they make it very easy to install WordPress. They call them one-click installs, and you can very quickly spin up a new WordPress site. I'll show you what it looks like behind the scenes. These are the files, and you'll notice that they resemble exactly like files on your own computer. If you were to go in, I'll give you an example here. This is a tool called FTP, like an FTP transfer tool. This one is called FileZilla. On my left side, these are files on my own computer. On the right side, I've logged in to a server where I can modify files. So I go into public HTML, and I've got all these folders and all these files, and this actually represents an actual website. So uploading, let's say, a new photo to a website is as easy as dragging it from the left side into the right side of my computer. So that's why I had to log in this way. If you use one of these platforms where you can click in and go right through, you have a similar type of experience, but it's in a browser. So here too, I can go right in and actually see the individual files of this website. And you'll notice every WordPress install has these three folders: WP admin, WP content, WP includes, and then a bunch of files that just sit right over here. Typically, WP admin and WP includes are almost always the same. You don't touch them at all. WP content varies from one website to the next. WP config is something where you might have to make changes to. So that's the files of a website. In parallel, you have the database of the website. There's a list of the databases, and each WordPress website has different individual database tables. They almost always start with WP, but you can change that. So WordPress. And the most common one that you probably are thinking of is something, for example, around posts. So this website actually doesn't have many posts, but if I click through to it over here, this is the database that stores all of WordPress's posts. Each row can represent a specific article or a part of an article. You can see it can get complicated quickly, but you could theoretically change and modify parts of your site right from here without having to log in to the WordPress website. So that's DreamHost, and they're very affordable. Sites start at just a few dollars a month to host, and you could be on their unlimited hosting, which is actually fine for a lot of smaller websites, and have several sites for like $10 a month. Then we get into the world of Cloudways. Cloudways is definitely the next level up. When you want to build in Cloudways, you actually pick a server. You can pick your own server and choose from a variety of different hosts that you want to use. So you can tell it, okay, I want to build a server, and it starts deploying a default application on that server. You give it a name, test, and the name of the server. Here. And then they offer you a range of very powerful hosting providers like Amazon, Google, or DigitalOcean. They're all big players in the field, but they'll build a really nice layer of interface and interaction on top of these providers, making it much easier for you to take care of your site. If you went to AWS directly, it would be an overwhelming experience full of technicalities and there'd be a lot of vulnerabilities you probably wouldn't even think of using. They take care of all of that. You would tell it the size of the server that you need, and they tell you here on the bottom what it'll cost. So it definitely costs more, but for high traffic websites, it's a huge difference in how it performs. They install WordPress for you and you're up and running right away. What I love about Cloudways is that you can log into a website. Here's a list of all the apps that I have on the same server. You can have multiple websites on the same server. I can go into this website called Booster Money, and they give you all of your passwords that you need to access the site in a very easy and organized way. They'll be like, here's what you need to access, your FileZilla files for your FTP. It's called FTP for File Transfer Protocol. This is your database. This is how to access your database. You could create new usernames for yourself to access FTP. And they give you your WordPress login right off the bat. It makes it very easy for you to log into your website and start doing the work on there. Wherever it's running, I'm going to go back to the server level for a second. Servers really are just external computers, right? They're just a computer that's sitting, it doesn't have a screen typically, but it is still running the same way, and it's been given to you to use. So if you go into monitoring, you can see here, you can keep track of that computer that you've been given to use. You can tell, for example, my server is running 2 gigabytes of RAM, and it has 50 gigabytes of disk storage and a dedicated IP address that points specifically to it. Right? So IP addresses, we'll talk about them more in a bit, but it's basically computer speak of where this server is located. The domain is how humans typically interact with it, but behind the scenes, this domain is actually pointing to a specific IP address, which then the browsers interpret and take you to a specific place. And so I can see here, I can keep an eye on, this is how much RAM I'm using, this is the CPU, this is how much storage space I've actually used. In Cloudways, I can actually expand and see which website is using the most memory, the most storage. And you can go into more details here and really see a graph on an hourly basis of how much your server is being used. And you can see here, idle CPU at some point. Almost all the CPU is free. Even at its lowest, we went down to 90% idle CPU. So 90% of the computer was not being used, is what we want. We don't want to be maxing out our computer. What happens when that happens is the server can crash, because it's just being asked to calculate too many things at once, and it goes down. A few more components that go into tying a functional website together. You have the actual domain, but then oftentimes what you need to do is domain records, DNS they're typically called. I'm going to show you a platform called Cloudflare that is very commonly used to set up these records, because a single domain, like myfancynewssite.com, can have a bunch of pieces of data associated with it that can let you do all sorts of things. You can obviously point the site itself to a specific location, but you can actually spin up entire sites based on making subdomains. So if I go to old.myfancynewssite, old can point to an entirely new place and be a completely different website, which is used often. Let's say you're trying to create a new version of a site and you're trying to test it out. You would just take the same domain, add the word new, and add a whole bunch of records to it. Similarly, the same website is actually also used to manage email, right? So if I email hello@myfancynewssite.com, that is going to go somewhere. It could be set up to go somewhere, and it uses a completely different set of records. So I'm going to show you a bunch of those records that tie it all together. So you get your domain, you can have your host, but then you need to go and change the records of your website on the receiving end. What that looks like is you would go into domain management and you tell Cloudways, this is the site that you should expect. By default, especially in DreamHost can too, gives you a random, WordPress dash something number. They give you a random URL right away that you can play around with. You can start sending links to clients. Once you're ready to launch your own URL on this, you need to set it up both on the server side and on the record side. On the server side, you tell it, this is going to be the name of my new domain. And you just tell it it's going to be called boostermoney.app. Okay, and you tell it to add this domain. I'm not going to click that now because it takes a few minutes to apply. You get a list of these domains. They can all point to the same place, and one of them gets to be the primary domain. That if I visited that URL, it would take me to that site, but then switch to say boostermoney.app, and that would be the primary domain. So once that's installed, you then typically have to set up your records. Cloudflare is a third-party provider that you can run your records through. One of its advantages is it can protect your website from different types of spam and attacks. So not only is it setting up your records for you, it's doing all sorts of additional protection. So a lot of our bigger sites, we run through Cloudflare as well. To run your site through Cloudflare, you go into GoDaddy or wherever you own the website and tell them, I don't want you to be managing my records anymore. I want Cloudflare to manage my records. So you change a specific kind of record called the NS record, the name server record, that says from now on, these records will be served by Cloudflare. You can very quickly use a tool, for example, like what's my DNS.net. I highly recommend what's my DNS. And you can go in and type in any URL that you want. So let's try shalomshore.com. And we're going to specifically look up its name server, NS records. Okay. Taking a long time. NS records, search. It's taking a second, but here you go. So here we have these 3 records. They're here for redundancy. In case one fails, the other one's still up. And it's saying, check DreamHost for the records. So I know that I never changed anything and it's going through DreamHost. But if you were to go to a place like the yeshivaworld.com, which is a high traffic website that I manage, it will actually show you Cloudflare. So now we're using Cloudflare to manage the records. NS records allow you to see where it's being run by. Once you go into a specific site, let's say you set up your records to run in Cloudflare, you go into this Cloudflare where the DNS records are managed, and there are all sorts of different kinds of records. And we can actually see them right over here. They're loading right now. So A records are always point to an IP address of some kind. You can see over here, there's an A record and it's pointing to an IP address. That's one of the most common ways in which you would link to a server. So if I wanted this domain to start pointing here, I would take the IP address they give me for my server and make sure that it points there. If I've set it up to be looking for that domain, that's all I need. That's a more common one. You could pretty much only have one A record set up for your root site, meaning shalomshore.com, mysite.com. That's the root. You can typically only have one. You can see it over here, jewishbreakingnews.com. It's got one A record. All these other ones, it might be hard to tell, actually go before it. So they don't say .com at the end. So it's actually ftp.jewishbreakingnews.com gets this IP address. cpanel.jewishbreakingnews.com is getting this address. So that's similar to what I was pointing out before. You could have ftp dot point to somewhere completely different if you wanted to. That is how that gets set up. The next type is called a CNAME. A CNAME record points to another place. So it's used for redirects. You can tell it, if somebody visits www.jewishbreakingnews.com, just redirect them to jewishbreakingnews.com. It's a way to get people pointed in different ways. Another kind of record is called a TXT record that adds text associated with a domain. It's useful for like domain verification. So let's say you're trying to prove to Google that you own a domain. They might give you a bit of text, add it to your name server, and then to your DNS records. When they check that it's there, you must be the owner. And then from then on, they treat you as the owner and give you special permissions. And one final record that is actually not being used right now, it doesn't look like, is called an MX record, and that's from Mail Exchange. And so if you want to have this domain be used for emails, make sure that it has those records set up as well. The interesting thing about the internet and how it works is that your email also actually uses a server. Your email files take up space, especially if they have an image attachment, and they get stored in their own type of server, and it can be a completely separate server from what your website is using. So you could be having, Cloudways hosting your actual website, but then using Gmail or DreamHost to host your other components of your site and route your emails. And that's the interesting thing here, is that Cloudways does a few things well, and that's like high-powered servers that scale easily. DreamHost, what I love about it is it's more of a one-size-fit-all. You have free mail that you can set up and inboxes and stuff like that. So that's why I recommend out of the box, because it actually does a little bit of everything. Records can take some time to propagate. These days, it used to take a few hours to start seeing those changes update on various networks across the globe. And for a few hours, your site is still pointing to the old address until it's gone through and propagated into this new updated one. But nowadays, it happens pretty quickly. But it's just something to keep in mind. Sometimes you've done everything right and it's not working because it just hasn't kicked in everywhere. A few final components that go into a working website is an SSL certificate. This is basically a certificate that says to a browser, yes, what the site that you think you're visiting is a site you're actually visiting. People can pretend to be a site they're not and deliver malicious code to your computer. All websites these days need to be served through SSL. Some platforms like GoDaddy will try to charge you like $200 a year for SSL, but there's nonprofits that will actually let you do it for free. A nonprofit called Let's Encrypt, and both Cloudways and DreamHost make it very easy for you to install a Let's Encrypt SSL certificate on your site. So you can see this website has its little lock here and it's encrypted. And right next to it, it says HTTPS. S is for secure. And it basically forces all the traffic to go through the secure certificate like that. And so every website that you spin up, once the proper domain has been installed, you tell it to install a certificate. Within a few minutes, it'll add it and install it, and you will no longer get any warnings when you visit a site. Another final thing to be aware of is something called SMTP. SMTP is the architecture that manages emails for a website or a person. So if you've ever had let's say a WordPress website that you're trying to get email notifications for and they're not working properly, that's because it's trying to use the default WordPress, the default server's email configuration. And sometimes that can be problematic. So like we said before about being able to use a email host that's separate from your website's host gets configured within SMTP. So that allows you to say, from here on out, if this server needs to send an email for any reason at all, oh, excuse me, whether you're notifying a user or helping someone recover their a lost password to a website, anything like that, you can tell it, run this emails through my own SMTP or a service called Elastic Email, and you can configure that way. So that's something a little bit more advanced. We can touch upon that later, but that's another component you can be aware of the things you can change on a server.